Summary of Poetics by Aristotle. Aristotle talks about poetry in Poetics. He talks about poetry in general and specific types of poetry. He also talks about how poetry affects people who read it and how to write a poetic story so that it has the most impact. He looks at each part of poems on its own and answers any questions that come up along the way. Aristotle starts with the rules of verse because, as he puts it, it is natural. He talks about the different kinds of poems, such as epic, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic, and music played on a pipe or lyre. His other claim is that all poetry is a type of imitation that is only different in three ways: the medium, the object, and the mode of imitation. Depending on the type of art, the medium of imitation is different. For example, a painter or sculptor might use color or shape as a medium, while a poet might use rhythm, language, and music. Each of these can be used by itself or together to achieve a certain result. It is the thing that is copied in a piece of art, in this case a song. Things, people, and events are all examples of objects. Objects can be either excellent or inferior, which means they are either morally good or bad. Last but not least, an object style of imitation is the way it is copied. When you write epic poems, you imitate an object through your story. When you write tragedy, you imitate an object through actors on stage. According to Aristotle, people naturally want to copy others and things. This is because we learned by copying others from a very young age, so naturally people want to copy other people and things. Aside from that, some people enjoy looking at upsetting pictures from a safe distance, like a stage. A big part of the pleasure people get from seeing a copy is that they understand it. As someone looks at a copy, they can tell what it is supposed to be and enjoy that knowledge. Furthermore, Aristotle says that humans naturally like rhythm and melody, which explains why they like to copy things like poetry, which uses language with both rhythm and tune. Dithyrambic poetry, which is a mix of poetry and dance, gave rise to tragedy. That's how tragedy changed over time to become what Aristotle calls its natural state. In comedy, weak people are portrayed as weak, but Aristotle says that weak characters are not always weak. There are laughable errors that characters in comedies make, but they don't make the viewer feel bad. A comedy shouldn't make people feel bad feelings, and it shouldn't try to imitate pain either. On the other hand, tragedy and epic poems both show good people, but epic only uses verse and tells a story. To put it simply, an epic doesn't have songs in it, and it's usually told from the point of view of a single character. Tragedies generally only cover one day of events, while epics usually last a long time. People who know a lot about tragedy will also know a lot about epic, because everything that is epic is also in tragedy. An epic poem, on the other hand, doesn't have everything that a tragedy does. A tragedy is a copy of a good deed that has unity and weight. A tragedy is written in language with rhythm and melody, and it is played by actors instead of being read aloud. The most important thing about tragedy is that it cleans the audience by making them feel fear and pity, which is called catharsis. There are 6 parts that make up a tragedy: the story, the characters, the language, the reasoning, the spectacle, and the lyric poetry. These parts determine the quality of the tragedy. The most important part of a tragedy, though, is the plot. It's not people that tragedy copies, it copies actions. The actions are what happen in the story. Also, the best ways for a disaster to make you feel better are through recognition and change, which are both parts of the plot. To be a tragedy, a story must have a clear beginning, middle, and end. A tragedy must have magnitude, which means it must shock the audience, but copying it can't be done for no reason. It's impossible to understand the whole story of a tragedy at once if the action being imitated is either too big or too small. A story is only unified if it imitates a complete action, just like an imitation is only unified if it shows a full action. Aristotle says that poetry doesn't copy what has happened, but rather what would happen, as long as it is likely or necessary to happen. Poets and historians are not different because they write in text and verse. What makes them different is that historians write about what happened and poets write about what would happen. There would still be historians who write in prose, but their work would not be called poetry. Poets write stories with plots that can include things that have already happened or things that are likely to happen again. But it's not enough for a tragedy to just copy an action, it must also make people feel the feelings they need for catharsis, and the best way to do that is through events that no one saw coming. A sad story always has a change of luck. A change of luck can be complex, in which the character recognizes or reverses the change, or simple, in which the character does not recognize or reverse the change. A reversal is a change to the opposite in the actions being performed. This happens because of necessity or probability, which means that it makes sense based on what has happened so far in the story. Recognition is a change from ignorance to knowledge that either shows a close relationship or an enemy on the part of the people who are marked for good or bad luck. Aristotle said that the best story is one in which recognition and reversal happen at the same time. This is what happens in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. When recognition and reversal happen together, they cause fear and pity, which are at the heart of disaster. This mix will either bring good luck or bad luck. Catharsis can also be achieved through tragedies that involve human pain, like war. Aristotle said that plays with complicated plots are the best. A good tragedy shouldn't show a character who is too good going from being good to bad, because that makes people angry and doesn't make them feel scared or sorry for them. Similarly, a character who is too bad shouldn't go from being bad to being good, because that change isn't sad and won't make people fear or feel sorry for them either. Still, a good tragedy does have a plot twist where things go from good to bad. This is because plots that end in good fortune are less sad and make people feel more fear and sympathy. Tragic acts are terrible or pitiable, and they can happen between family members, enemies, or people who don't have a relationship with each other. What makes people most afraid and sad are terrible or pitiable acts that happen between close friends or family, like killing your father or son. The next thing Aristotle talks about is characters in tragedy. He lists 4 things that make up a character. The first is goodness, which is what makes a person decent in what they do and how they act. It is also important that a character's imitation is suitable and has the right amount of likeness, or similarity. Lastly, a character should be consistent. If they need to or probably will act in a way that isn't consistent, they should be consistently inconsistent. Poets should always picture a story as they write it so they can find mistakes and things that don't make sense. Every tragedy needs a problem and a way to solve it. The problem and the answer should be made with the same amount of care and attention. The language and thinking used in a tragedy can be broken down even further into their own parts, such as nouns, verbs, and utterances. The most important thing about language is clarity, as long as there is no loss of dignity. Standard words that are used in everyday speech are part of clear diction. However, using only standard words in a poem is not creative or original and causes a loss of dignity. To find the right mix, there needs to be use of both common words and exotic expressions, which are words that the poet made up or are not commonly used. Good poetry uses all kinds of language, but metaphors and unusual words are especially important. Aristotle said that most of the time, people who don't like poetry say that it's impossible, illogical, harmful, contradictory, or wrong. Things that don't make sense or seem impossible often aren't as impossible as they may seem, especially since it's actually very likely that things that don't seem likely will happen. Also, something that doesn't make sense or seems to be contradictory could just be a copy of something that should be or is thought to be, not what it really is. It's easy for Aristotle to ignore all of the common arguments against poetry. Some people may wonder if tragedy is better than epic, and Aristotle says that tragedy is definitely better. Lyric poetry and spectacle are sources of intense pleasure, but an epic poem doesn't have them. A tragedy is also shorter. It is Aristotle's opinion that what is more concentrated is more pleasant than what is watered down by being extended in time. For example, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles would not be nearly as powerful if it were as long as Homer's Iliad. Lastly, it can be hard to bring everyone together in an epic because it is so much longer than a tragedy. Aristotle believes that tragedy is better than epic poetry because of this reason. Nevertheless, he contends that the terror and pity that follows, as well as the catharsis that results from them, are what truly make tragedy superior to epic poetry.
About the author. Aristotle was born in the classical time in the city of Stagira in northern Greece. His father, Nicomachus, was a doctor who worked for the Macedonian court. Before 367 BC, when he went to Athens to study at Plato's academy, we don't know much about his life. He stayed there until Plato died in 347. After that, Aristotle moved to Asia Minor, where he continued to study philosophy with the help of Hermias, a pro-Macedonian king whose daughter, Pythias, he married. A few years later, he went back to Macedon and began teaching Alexander the Great there in 343. In 334, he went back to Athens and opened the Lyceum, which was his own school for philosophy. Plato's philosophy was very different from Aristotle's in important ways, especially when it came to the forms, which Aristotle thought were too vague to be useful to most people. Aristotle is sometimes just called the philosopher, but his ideas have had a huge impact on philosophy up to the present day, not just in ancient Greece or Western Europe, but also in the medieval Islamic world. His ideas have also influenced the natural sciences, psychology, politics, and rhetoric for hundreds of years. After his wife Pythias died, Aristotle had a child with a woman named Herpyllis. Their son was named Nicomachus. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is likely named after his son or his father. Aristotle died in Chalcis, Euboea.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.